Alright, gamers. After a short hiatus, the Prismatic Draft League is back for Season 5. My fourth season in the league, and the second one that I'm recording for this channel, I have once again entered my team, the Halifax Masquerainmen, hoping for a better season than the last time. This one's going to be a VGC Regulation F Draft League season. I believe we did Reg D last time, so a lot is going to have changed with both the Teal Mask and the Indigo Disc having come out in between. That said, this is going to be very different from the Reg F that you're familiar with, and we might as well jump right into why. So, before we get to my picks, here are the roster configuration rules for this season. You can see that the Pokemon are sorted into several tiers: S+, S, A, B, C, D, and at the very bottom, untiered. And here are the slots that we get free for each tier for our rosters. An S+ or S, an A or B, B, 2 C's, and a D. No mandatory untiered slot this time. These two slots that have the choice in them, they work the same way as last season. If you take an S+ here, then you can get a B in this slot, but if you take an S, then you get an extra A. Finally, these 4 slots down here, the what they call the free agent slots, are the only ones that have a points budget. 130 points, and you can see the prices by tier over here. So there's some flexibility in the Pokemon that I can put into these slots as long as I don't go over budget. These also are the only slots that I can swap out for Pokemon in the undrafted pool. In other words, if I want to make a change to my roster at some point in the season, I can trade any Pokemon on my team, any one of these 11, for a Pokemon from another player's team. But if I don't want to get another team involved, and I want to just take one from the pool of available Pokemon that aren't on any roster, I can only do that in these 4 slots down here. So that really shakes up some of the choices that people have to make in the draft. I remember, I think last season, my first round pick was a Pokemon that I put in a free agent slot because I thought I might want to swap it out later, and I ended up doing that. It's just a little extra layer of complexity. It's honestly not my favorite rule, but a little extra layer of complexity in the draft. So the reason that this is going to look very different from the Regulation F that VGC players know and love right now is basically the strict tiering rules. A lot of Pokemon are packed into the S and S+ tiers, and every team only gets one Pokemon from one of those tiers, not even one from each. And there are only 10 teams in the league this season. So, off the top of my head, some notable Pokemon that went undrafted. Both forms of Urshifu went undrafted. I believe Incarnate Tornadus did as well. Chien-Pao, Raging Bolt, Gouging Fire, stuff like Dragonite, Goldango, and Kingambit. 3 forms of Ogerpon went undrafted. Hearthflame Mask was the only one that anyone picked. And maybe my favorite of these little details, Grookey and Thwackey were both drafted, but Rillaboom was not. This is a league that forces you to look down to the lower parts of the tier list and pick some Pokemon that you might normally overlook, which I think is part of the fun, but it's going to be it's going to make for an interesting metagame for sure. Now, the full extent of my pre-draft prep was I looked over the high tiers in the dock, and I saw a couple mons that caught my attention, and then I saw 3 Pokemon core that I wanted. 3 Pokemon that I thought complemented each other really well and could be fun and interesting to use. And I just went into the draft hoping that I would get all 3. Fingers crossed, hope for the best, and I'll figure it out later. I had the 2nd overall pick out of 10 in the snake draft. Incineroar went 1st overall. Shocking, I know. And then I got the guy that I wanted 2nd overall, and that was S+ tier Incarnate Thundurus. So Thundurus doesn't see a ton of play in VGC right now, especially compared to Tornadus, who I just told you went undrafted. But Thundurus was for sure one of the Pokemon that most caught my eye when I was looking over the draft board. And a lot of that has to do with what a flexible, versatile Pokemon it is, which is something really valuable in draft. So the main role that I see for Thundurus is Prankster support, and it gets a lot of interesting support options. You can do the basic stuff like Taunt, Thunder Wave, Scary Face, Eerie Impulse. It gets manual Electric Terrain and manual Rain Dance, both buffed by Prankster, and I do build out the rest of this team with those 2 things in mind. This team will definitely have an Electric Terrain mode and a Rain mode. It can also set up with Prankster Nasty Plot, and special attack stat is pretty good. It can throw off Wild Bolt Storm, which has the same drawback as Bleak Wind Storm, but is a strong spread attack that I believe can inflict paralysis. And with all of that said, I don't even have to run Prankster. If I think the matchup is right some week, I could bring Defiant Thundurus into Intimidate stuff or something. Thundurus is... It's Pokemon that I used a lot in Sword and Shield. I haven't had much reason to use it in Scarlet and Violet VGC, but it's a fascinating Pokemon because it just does so many things well. I think it's going to be interesting for my opponents to try to prepare for. It also is going to have a nasty case of 4 move slot syndrome through like the whole season, I'm pretty sure. But we'll deal with that as we go. Hopefully we built out the right supports around it. But Thundurus, I mean, there are a ton of weather teams in this draft, which I didn't know was going to happen, but it has happened. I don't think anyone drafted Psy-Spam. There are a couple of grassy terrain setters out there, obviously. But Thundurus is a strong Pokemon for weather and terrain control. And yeah, there's a lot that it can do to enable its teammates, or try to go in offensively itself. It just seems like a really solid Pokemon all around for the versatile counter-teaming style that succeeds in draft leagues. And it also pairs nicely with the second Pokemon I wanted, which I took in the second round. A tier. Iron Leaves. Iron Leaves, I'm not going to talk Iron Leaves up as much as I did Thundurus. Honestly, to some extent, the reason I picked this is it's a cool Pokemon that I've just never had occasion to try out in VGC. I don't know for sure that Iron Leaves is going to be good, but I definitely want to give it a go, and I want to explore what it can do. So if Thundurus is the Pokemon that I'm building around because I think it's a really solid, amazing Pokemon that's going to be hard for my opponents to deal with, Iron Leaves is the Pokemon that I want to study and explore over the course of this season. That said, I think I got a lesson last season in the value of having just a strong synergistic combo of Pokemon that I can lean on in tough situations. When I picked up Espathra and Sandy Shocks both late in the season, and they gave my team a real boost. And so I think the combination of manual electric terrain and terrain boosted Psyblade gives this team a little bit of extra threat that it is going to need to succeed in this season, right? Like, that's just a really strong thing that I can bring any given week that opponents have to be prepared for. It's not going to win a set by itself, but having that kind of star power available to the team, I think, can be important. And so, obviously, there are 9 more Pokemon to go through, and I'll have a lot more modes that I can bring, but having that baseline, I can bring terrain-boosted Psyblade, is going to be pretty solid. And Iron Leaves can do more than that. I've dug into its move pool a little bit. It has pretty decent coverage. It has some support options. But yeah, the strong Psyblade is the main draw here for sure. And here's where we get to a little bit of bad news, because the third Pokemon that I wanted from my pre-draft ideal 3 Pokemon core was Primarina. Primarina, I think, would have been excellent on this team. It complements the Iron Leaves stuff because it's a strong fairy type that I can throw at a random Terra Dark or something that tries to shut Iron Leaves down. And it also plays nicely in Manual Rain set by Thundurus, being a strong water-type special attacker with its water-type attacks buffed by Rain. It would also give me a Grass-type and a Water-type within the first 3 rounds, so I'd be just 1 away from a Fire-Water Grass core. It's a special attacker. Thundurus kind of is too, but I'll probably be bringing Thundurus in a support role at least some of the time. But pair that strong special attacker Primarina with the physical attacking Iron Leaves would have been great. Unfortunately, Primarina was taken like early 2nd round. When I was picking Iron Leaves, Primarina was already gone. But I still liked the roles that I had in mind for it, and I didn't want to give any of them up. I was going to lose some role compression not being able to get Primarina, but I thought even separating out the rain-abusing water type from the reasonably bulky fairy type, those were both valuable things to have. I still could have had a water and fairy type in the A tier with Azumarill, and I did think about that, and I think Belly Drum Azumarill with like Terra Water, Aqua Jet, and Rain would have been interesting, but I didn't trust Azumarill that much in the fairy type role. So I decided to separate those roles and that they were still worth having separated, and I used my 3rd round pick to fill my first free agent slot with A tier Sylveon. So Sylveon obviously is not a water type, but it brings to the table a lot of what Primarina does as a fairy type. It's fairly bulky, especially on the special side. It hits reasonably hard, especially with Pixelate boosted Hyper Voice, maybe a Throat Spray, maybe I can find a Calm Mind boost or something. Strong Fairy type spread damage into both opponents. Immediately it's harder for an opponent to just use Dark types to deal with Iron Leaves, right? Sylveon is also just, it's a strong Fairy type Pokemon all around. Fairy is a good type. I don't think I need to do too much to sell this pick here. It's, again, a possible setup attacker. It's a special attacker. It also has some support options. But yeah, I feel like I have my Fairy type role pretty well covered here. And so that brings me to thinking about, I still want a Water type. I still want a Fire, Water, Grass core. But at this point, I can only afford one more A-tier Pokemon, because I have 90 points to go between, 3 free agent slots. And there were a couple of lanes that I felt like I could choose here. Another thing about Sylveon that I meant to say is, because of Pixelate, Terra Blast is Fairy type before you Terra, and then it changes to your Terra type. So that's a really fun trick that Sylveon can pull that not much can in today's game. Anyway, on the one hand, I wanted to start building out a rain mode, and Basket Legion was available in the A tier, and seemed pretty clearly a cut above the other Swift Swimmers. There are a lot of Swift Swimmers further down the tier list, but Basket Legion was an A for a reason. On the other hand, this is in part an electric terrain team, and I didn't want to make an electric terrain team with only one future Paradox Pokemon. That felt like a waste. And that last A tier slot was my last place where I could put a future Paradox Pokemon, because all of them were tiered A or higher. So I had a bit of a dilemma on my hands, and I thought about it for a while, and I actually did come to a decision, but I didn't commit to that decision in this round. Something that I've run into a couple of times in draft leagues, and I don't know, leave a comment if you've played a draft and you've run into a situation like this. I was brainstorming cores with Basket Legion, and I was brainstorming cores with Iron Treads, which was available in the A tier as well. And both cores seemed pretty solid and interesting, and then they started to overlap. There's one Pokemon that I was interested in, no matter what I got with my last available A tier slot. So I decided to go ahead and draft that first. And that's how my 4th round pick became B tier Magmar. Magmar is, I think, potentially the best version of the kind of fire type that I was likely to get at this point in the draft. Again, I knew that I wanted a fire type because I already had Iron Leaves, and I was definitely going to take a water type to take advantage of Manual Rain. But because I wasn't prioritizing a fire type relative to these other slots on the team, I wasn't going to get some superstar heavy hitter. I wasn't getting Hearth Flame Ogrepon, I wasn't getting Chi-Yu. I was maybe getting like Charizard, and Charizard might have been interesting on this team. But for the most part, I was getting like a solid, bulky, tanky fire type, maybe with some offense, but probably with a need for it to have something else to do. And Magmar seemed pretty solid in that for what it is, considering the kind of fire type that I was likely to be able to get. It's fairly bulky with an Eviolite. It has a decent supporting move pool, has stuff like Knockoff, Will-O-Wisp. I think it has Clear Smog, maybe. And of course, I'm burying the lead here. It has Follow Me, which almost makes a Pokemon worth it by itself. The other thing that I like about Follow Me Magmar on this team specifically is I've drafted some special bulk already with Sylveon and Iron Leaves. Magmar has a little bit of special bulk itself as well, but given that I was already filling the high tier slots on my team, it didn't look like I was going to get a very good Intimidate Pokemon if I got one at all. And so I started thinking about other ways to mitigate physical damage. This is where I mention again that Magmar has Will-O-Wisp, but also, of course, Magmar has the combination of Follow Me and Flame Body, which can make it a real threat to hinder a physical attacker. So Magmar, I don't expect Magmar to be some game-breaking Pokemon, but I think it's going to be fairly solid in its role. There was one other Pokemon that I strongly considered with this pick, and that was Drifblim. Drifblim can also mitigate physical attackers. It has Will-O-Wisp and Strength Sap. It also can set Tailwind. However, I felt like the ideas that I had in mind for how to use Drifblim leaned pretty heavily on activating Unburden, and that's hard to do without committing some significant resources to it. Obviously, I could do Manual Electric Terrain Thundurus with Electric Seed Drifblim, and maybe that would have been good, but it felt kind of forced. I would get into awkward positions trying to get those guys lined up in the correct position in the correct order, And Driftblim, though it's an interesting Pokemon, I don't think it's the kind that you want to try to force a game plan to run through. Magmar felt more solid to me because I don't need to build a game plan around Magmar. It should be able to just show up, be a complementary piece, play its role. And hey, maybe Follow Me can help Iron Leaves to get off an extra attack in Electric Terrain, or Sylveon to get a Calm Mind, or Thundurus a nasty plot. Who knows? I could do a lot. It's just a great move all around. After that, I decided it was time to pick a lane, figure out what I was going to do with my last A-tier slot, and like I said, I didn't want to have only one future Paradox Pokemon, but also I knew that I was going to take a water type that could abuse Rain. Basculegion might have been the best one, but there were a lot of those further down the draft board. What seemed harder to replace if I didn't pick it here was my last A-tier Pokemon, Iron Treads. Iron Treads, I think, rounds out this team pretty nicely with its grounded steel typing. I already knew by this point that I wasn't going to get a Dragon type, or at least I was pretty sure I wasn't going to. There really aren't any good ones available outside of the highest tiers. So no Fairy Dragon Steel Core here, but having two pieces of that is still pretty good. It does complement Sylveon pretty well. It also complements Thundurus. I could put them next to each other, maybe with Electric Terrain up and do Disquake stuff or something like that. Yeah, it just rounds out the team's type coverage pretty nicely, while also giving me another Pokemon that benefits from Electric Terrain. And Iron Treads is a really strong Pokemon. People sleep on it, including me. I sleep on it all the time, because it doesn't really have a place in the proper VGC meta, at least not that I know of right now. And I've never known it to see very much use. But in absolute terms, it's a very strong Pokemon, and in a draft format like this, I definitely think it can be a threat. Boosting its speed or its attack, and going in with, Earthquakes or Steel attacks or, whatever works given the situation. I think it's just a good complementary piece, rounds out the team pretty nicely. But now we get to round 6, and finally I was going to take that Rain Abuser. And once again, I did get a little bit indecisive between two options. I actually typed out my pick in the Discord channel, but then before I hit enter, I went back to Bulbapedia, and I was scrolling up and down for Alligator's Bulbapedia page, and I was checking whether Floatzel could do anything worthwhile. I think for Alligator would have been interesting. It doesn't get Swift Swim, but has a lot else going for it with Sheer Force, Swords Dance, Dragon Dance, Aqua Jet, etc. But I didn't take for Alligator. I stuck to the Pokemon whose name I had already typed. B tier, Barraskewda. Barraskewda is definitely the glass cannon of this team so far. It's a very frail Pokemon, and I have to keep that in mind when I use it. That said, it's extremely fast even before Swift Swim. It's probably the fastest Swift Swim user. I haven't fact-checked that. And if I get some Rain Dance setup going, I can pivot it with Flip Turn, or just go for big damage with Liquidation. It's another, sort of in the vein of Iron Leaves. It's a major offensive threat with just like half a turn of setup that an opponent has to take seriously and prepare for. And like I said, I can pivot it around. I have Fire, Water, Grass Core with Barraskewda, Iron Leaves, and Magmar. I have some fairly bulky other Pokemon like Sylveon and Iron Treads to complement it. I have Magmar to redirect an attack away from it, which can give it a little bit more survivability. I also can run Propeller Tail if I don't need Swift Swim and I'm worried about an opponent's Follow Me user or something. I'm maybe not as sold on Barraskewda as I sound right now. It's definitely a Pokemon that brings some very real upside and also comes with some risks. It is, again, very frail, but it's just such an instant threat that I think is going to warp opponents' team building to an extent. And stacking that up with the likes of Iron Leaves, I think, gives me a lot of strong options as long as I bring the right modes to my games. And this is, at this point, this is kind of a transitional point in the draft. One, because everything that we can take from here is C tier or below. Can't afford anything B or higher. And two, at this point I've pretty well covered everything that I've talked about up to this point. I got two of the three guys I wanted right off the bat. I have a Fire, Water, Grass Core, I have a Rain Abuser, I have two future Paradox Pokemon. I could go anywhere in the rest of the draft. I could do anything I want except draft actual good Pokemon. So it's perhaps not surprising that my 7th round pick was a pretty generic but strong support Pokemon. And a normal type at that. I went with C tier Persian. Persian, well, you can see the stats. It's not bringing much to the table stats-wise except speed. It's not going to do much damage, although it does get Technician boosted Fake Out, so that's something. But Persian has an incredible support move pool. I'm not even going to try off the top of my head. I know it gets Fake Out and Feint. I know it gets Icy Wind. I think it gets some stat-lowering moves like Growl, Fake Tears. Maybe it gets Snarl. I don't even know, but just scroll through Persian's move pool like I did when I was preparing to draft it. It has a very solid speed tier for this format and a ton of support options that I can use to enable whatever kind of offensive mode I want to bring. So even though it's not a pick that's especially tailored to this team specifically, it is to an extent. I mean, I think that some of the offensive threats that I have here are going to benefit from things like Fake Out support. But it's just a Pokemon it's just really good value for a C-tier Pokemon. It can slot really nicely into all kinds of teams. My other two C-tier picks are maybe not super inspired, but I do really like what I got in the next round. I got I think I rounded out the team's coverage a little bit more with C-tier Beartic, the rare Swift Swim user that isn't a water type. Beartic, so I drafted Beartic with, in my mind, an idea where I might be using a rain mode with like Thundurus, Barraskewda, maybe Iron Leaves, and you know, if I'm throwing off Wild Bolt Storms and Liquidation or Flip Turn or what have you, I don't want that to be walled by Dragon types. And Beartic gives me strong coverage into Dragons, being an Ice type that also benefits from Swift Swim. It has a high attack stat. The speed's not great, but Swift Swim can patch that up. It's just different coverage from Barraskewda in a rain mode, so that, again, I don't think I'm just going to steamroll every... I don't think it's going to be as easy as just steamrolling an opponent with manual rain and 2 Swift Swim users. But I'm piling up offensive threats, and I think that they complement each other fairly well. And that's what Beartic is here to do. And I think that's a reasonable amount to ask for from a C-tier pick. My last C-tier pick, I wanted a special attacker because I had kind of piled up physical attackers over the last few picks with Iron Treads, Barraskewda, and Beartic, as well as my earlier pick of Iron Leaves. It felt like the team was noticeably missing a little bit of special offense by comparison, and I went up and down the C-tier list for special attackers. I was even looking at Yanmega for a while, which is a Pokemon that I like a lot and I think could have been fun. But I think that I get better value with my actual pick, Mismagius, in a free agent slot. So if this doesn't work out, I can swap it out for something else. Mismagius not only is a reasonably strong special attacker, with it, but also has a decent speed tier and a solid support move pool. Doubling down on some things that I already have, like Will-O-Wisp and Icy Wind, but another user of those doesn't hurt. It also gets Perish Song, so if I'm having trouble breaking... nobody got Dondozo and Tatsugiri this season, but if I'm having trouble breaking some kind of bulky mode, I have that threat into it. And I believe Mismagius also gets Nasty Plot, so that's another potential setup attacker that I can use, maybe for some big special damage next to immediate burst offense physical attackers that the opponent has to adjust for. So maybe I can create some openings that way. We'll see. I did think about Mischievous instead. Mischievous is untiered. I think it's... I've thought for a long time that it's one of the best Pokemon that this league puts in untiered. And of course, it can go bulky with an Eviolite and run similar support options, things like Perish Song, Icy Wind, Will-O-Wisp. But I already have an Eviolite support Pokemon higher up in my draft list. That doesn't mean that I won't draft more. In fact, we'll see in the next couple picks. Magmar is not my only not fully evolved Pokemon, but I do want to be mindful about how much competition I want to create for that item. But the main reason I chose Mismagius over Mischievous is more offense and a higher speed tier. Mischievous doesn't really fill the special attacker role that I thought I wanted, and the extra speed I think could be useful for throwing off a Will-O-Wisp or even an Icy Wind or something. Even just getting off a Perish Song before going down. So yeah, we'll see how Mismagius does. Anyway, 2 picks left, a D tier, and I only have the budget in my free agent slot for an untiered Pokemon, and we are going straight to somebody not fully evolved. A very silly guy right out of my childhood. My D tier pick was Gligar. I don't have a great track record with D tier picks. I've never really had one that I thought was worthwhile outside of that one Flareon game last season, which I did get pretty excited about. But what I've sort of come to accept is that it is possible that I don't know how to draft for good value in D tier, but they're also just not good Pokemon. Like, this is a league that forces you to draft bad Pokemon to an extent, and that's not a complaint. I think it's fun. I think it adds a layer that makes the league a little more interesting, but I have to have realistic expectations for what I'm going to get in the D tier. All of that said, I think Gligar has the potential to be pretty interesting. It can be bulky with an Eviolite if I don't need Magmar to do that. Its physical defense in particular is already pretty high before the Eviolite. It can set Tailwind. I do have a Tailwind setter. It's certainly not one of the better ones, and I don't think that I'm going to be leaning on Tailwind heavy game plans, but the option does exist if I want it. Gligar does get Tailwind. It also gets Breaking Swipe, which ticks another box for ways to mitigate physical damage. It has potential to be a tanky Pokemon. It also can go offensive with a Swords Dance set or something. I even think that maybe some week, if I think the matchup makes sense, I'll bring like Electric Seed Acrobatics Gligar with Thundurus. I'm not going to commit to that right now, but it's an idea that came into my head in the draft. So Gligar, I feel like Gligar is about all I can ask for in a D tier pick. It's not a very good Pokemon, but it has a bunch of tools that are at least vaguely interesting that might be worth a try at some point in the season. And maybe they can double down on what this team is. Maybe they can force an opponent to adapt to something they didn't expect. It also is a second ground type and a second flying type, so if I bring a Disquake game plan with Thundurus and Iron Treads, or even just one of those pieces without the other, I do have an immunity to my own Discharge, my own Earthquake, what have you. I don't think it's very likely that we get into that situation, but I do have another immunity that I can throw next to those guys if I want to. And finally, an untiered Pokemon with the last pick, Slowpoke. Funnily enough, Galarian Slowpoke was the pick immediately before this one. But I drafted Slowpoke for one simple reason, and I've actually had it in an earlier season. I drafted it for the same reason then. It gives me a little scrap of a crumb of Trick Room counterplay that isn't just like Taunt and Protect. Slowpoke gets Trick Room itself. It also gets Imprison. It can conceivably sit on the field and block Trick Room, although, again, there's competition. Depending on the matchup, there might be competition for the Eviolite, so I don't know that this is going to be as useful as it was in the previous season. But Slowpoke also has disruptive moves like Yawn and will underspeed pretty much anything with base 15 speed. So, in theory, it can function like a worse version of what Amoonguss does into an opponent's Trick Room in VGC. I don't think it's going to be good. It's an untiered pick for a reason. But it does have that small niche that made it seem worth drafting over the other untiered Pokemon. Finally, before I wrap up, here's a recap of the entire draft. If anyone's curious, I'm not going to read out every pick, but you can pause it and look through, see what people picked. It is, of course, a snake draft, so the team that went first in round 1 went last in round 2 and first in round 3, and so on. I noted already that a lot of really notable Pokemon in Regulation F were not drafted because the draft rules just didn't allow for very many of them to be. But if you want to look through this and see what Pokemon people were interested in, maybe see how people constructed their teams, we'll go through the matchups week by week as we always do. But this is the entire draft right here. And I'm looking forward to playing out the season. I think it's going to be a fun one. Only 10 teams with all the power of Regulation F, but also forced to pick some bad stuff. It's going to make for an interesting time, and I'm looking forward to getting started. But for now, this is it. Battles probably will start going up a week from now. See you then.